Evening. Settle in. I'm your storyteller tonight. No rush, no noise, just a road, a secret, and one hard choice. Stay close. Listen.
One letter destroyed everything. What was he hiding for years? On the first morning of April, when the frost still lay in the hollows behind the chicken coop and the plum trees were only just beginning to show white at the tips, Martha Bell stood at the kitchen table with her sleeves rolled to the elbow, kneading bread while the house was quiet around her. The lamp had been put out half an hour earlier, but dawn had not yet fully settled into the rooms. A pale grey light came in through the thin curtains and laid itself over the dresser, the clock, the row of clean jars waiting for summer. The whole house carried the smell of yeast, wood smoke, and the damp earth that clung to boots in spring. Her youngest, Elsie, was asleep on the settle by the stove, with one small fist curled under her cheek. Her son Daniel, who had turned 12 in winter and now believed himself taller and harder than he was, had gone with a pail to fetch water from the pump before school. In the bedroom off the hall, her husband Thomas was still in bed, or so she thought. For years she had learned the sounds of the house the way other women learned prayers. A board giving under a certain foot, a cough from behind a door, the knock of a lid, the wind at the loose corner of the roof. That morning there was something she could not name, some silence where another sound ought to have been. She pressed the dough hard with the heel of her hand and listened. A horse moved outside, not theirs. The Bells had sold their mare 2 winters before and never replaced her. This was a sharper sound, a restless shifting, bit and harness lightly striking. Martha wiped flour on her apron and crossed to the window. At the gate was a cart from Miller's yard, and beside it was young Ned Miller, shoulders hunched in the cold, cap pulled low. When she opened the door, the cold came in at once, raw and wet. Ned looked at her with the careful face of a boy sent on a grown person's errand. "Morning, Mrs. Bell." "Morning," she said. "What is it?" He glanced past her into the house, then back at the yard. "Mr. Bell asked me yesterday if I'd come by early, said he had a trunk to take." She stared at him. A trunk? Ned shifted on his feet. "To the station." For a moment she thought he must have the wrong house, or the wrong Bell, or that some cousin of Thomas's had written, and she had forgotten the letter. Then she saw, over the boy's shoulder, the bedroom window standing a crack open. Thomas never opened windows in cold weather. He said the damp got into his bones. "Wait there," Martha said, though her voice sounded strange in her own ears. She went down the hall and pushed open the bedroom door. The bed was stripped of the old brown valise Thomas had kept under it. 2 shirts were gone from the peg. His Sunday jacket was missing. The drawer where he kept his papers was half open and empty enough to tell its own story. On the washstand lay his wedding ring. She did not touch it right away. She stood looking at it, a plain band with the finish worn soft over the years, and felt the room tilt very slightly, as though the house itself had shifted on its stones. From the kitchen, Elsie called in her drowsy little voice, "Mama!" Martha closed her hand around the ring and went back. By breakfast time, the bread was forgotten. Daniel came in with water sloshing over his boots and stopped short when he saw the cart. Elsie sat at the table with her hair loose and thin, rubbing her eyes. Ned stood outside like a witness who wanted to be anywhere else. Martha poured porridge into bowls, set them down, and said in the plainest tone she could manage, "Your father has gone away."
Daniel blinked. "Where?" "To the station, by the look of it." "For work?" he asked.
She looked at him. He was trying to place this inside the world as he knew it, where men left for timber camps, for road crews, for harvest, and came back with blistered hands and stories that smelled of beer. She wished for him that it were that simple. "I don't know," she said. That was the first lie, or perhaps it was only the first refusal. Some part of her knew already that men did not leave rings behind when they meant to come home by Saturday. By noon, the news had run ahead of fact, as news always did. Mrs. Pike from 2 houses down came with a basket of eggs she did not mean to give, and sat herself by the table, all sympathy in the mouth and bright curiosity in the eyes. Mr. Green from the store nodded too solemnly when Martha went for flour and said, "Hard times make hard choices." The minister's wife sent over a broth nobody touched. By evening, Martha knew that the whole town was waiting to see whether she would cry in public or rage or pack up her children and go to her sister in Ohio. Instead, she drew water, fed the hens, mended Daniel's cuff, bathed Elsie, and put both children to bed as if the day had been any other day at all. Only when the house was quiet and the dark had thickened around the windows did she sit alone at the kitchen table and unfold the note Thomas had left under the bread tin. "Martha, I have gone to begin work in Albany. There is an opportunity there, and I cannot pass it by. I know this seems sudden, but I have thought on it for a long time. It is better done this way than by argument. You will manage. I will send money when I can. Take care of the children. Thomas." No tenderness, no explanation, no promise beyond money when I can, no ending except his name. She read it 3 times, then held it over the lamp flame and watched the edges curl black. When she let go, the ash fell into the saucer she used for buttons. If that had been all, perhaps the story would have settled into one kind of sorrow: a husband gone north, a wife left to scrape and stretch, children learning to do without. There were enough such stories in the valley. But life does not always stop at the first wound. By June, the plum blossoms had gone, and in their place small green fruit hung bitter and hard on the branches. Thomas sent one money order, smaller than it ought to have been. He wrote no letter with it. Martha took in sewing from the Bakers and the Holts and Mrs. Pike, though she hated the woman's habit of watching her face while speaking Thomas's name by accident. She rose before light, baked, washed, patched, weeded the garden, and in the evenings read aloud to Elsie while Daniel pretended not to listen from his chair by the door. The days were so full that grief had to stand back and wait its turn. Once a week she walked to the post office and asked whether there was anything for her. Most times there was nothing. The clerk, Mr. Jameson, had the decency to look at the pigeonholes instead of at her. In August, when the roads were baked white and the air around noon stood still as a held breath, a letter came, addressed not to Martha Bell, but to Thomas Bell, care of this address, in a hand she did not know. Mr. Jameson turned it over in his fingers. "I suppose I ought not," he murmured. "She is my husband," Martha said. He hesitated just long enough to remind both of them of proper rules, then handed it across. She took it home unopened. All afternoon it sat on the shelf above the sink while she shelled peas. She watched it in the corner of her eye, as though it might speak first.
At last, after the children were asleep, she broke the seal and tail first dragged it into the world. Dear Tom, I do not know why you have stopped writing. Maybe you are angry with me. Maybe you are afraid. But it is not only me now. The boy has been coughing again, and Dr. Avery says the damp in this room is no good for him. You said by summer we would be settled. You said once your wife understood things could not go on as they were, we would not have to hide. I am tired of waiting for promises. He asks for you by name now. Imagine that. A child should not have to ask. If you mean to come, come. If not, say so plainly, and I will know what kind of man I have trusted. Lydia. Martha sat so still that the whole room seemed to freeze around her. Outside, crickets rasped in the weeds. Somewhere a dog barked twice and gave up. In her hands, the letter felt heavier than paper should. A wife understood, a child asking for him by name, not some foolish affair begun after he left, not a sin of sudden loneliness, something older, something arranged in secrecy while he had sat at her table and eaten her bread and watched his own children sleep. She read it again, then set it down and placed both palms flat on the table. Her first feeling was not rage, it was humiliation, clean and cold. She thought of all the evenings Thomas had said he was at the depot, at Miller's Yard, helping on the grain ledger for Mr. Pike, of all the Sundays he had gone ahead to town on some excuse while she buttoned the children, of all the years in which she had believed the distance in him was tiredness, worry, a man's closed nature, all the ordinary darknesses of marriage. To learn that she had been living not in ignorance alone, but in a false arrangement, made her flush, even there in the empty kitchen. When Daniel woke from a dream and called out, she folded the letter and tucked it into her apron. She went to him, sat on the edge of his bed, and laid a hand on his hair until he slept again. Only then did she begin to cry, and because she would not let the children hear, she pressed her face into the counterpane in the spare room and shook without sound.
In the weeks that followed, she said nothing to anyone. Not to Mrs. Pike, not to the minister, not even to her sister Ruth when a letter came inviting them west for the winter. Silence became her pride. She would not hand Thomas's shame round the town like a basket for others to pick through. But secrets are greedy things. They do not stay where one puts them. The first break came in October at the harvest social in the church hall. Martha had not meant to go. She was tired from canning apples and seeing to the coal delivery, and she had no taste for fiddles or cakes or the kind of laughter that turns when one enters a room alone. Yet Daniel had helped raise the platform for the children's recitations, and Elsie had practiced a hymn with the others all week. So Martha pinned up her hair, wore the blue dress she saved for funerals and Christmas, and went. The hall was crowded, hot with bodies and kerosene light. Men smelled of hay and tobacco, women of starch and soap. Children ran under elbows until someone hissed their names. Martha stood at the back near the coffee urn, hands folded, answering when spoken to and avoiding the questions she could see gathering in certain faces. Then the minister's wife, who was soft-hearted but careless with her tongue, said, in front of 3 others, "I had a note from my cousin in Albany. She says there is a woman there, a Mrs. Gray, keeping company with a man very like your Thomas, though of course these city cousins see scandal in every shadow." The room did not go silent. That would have been kinder. It merely thinned around the words.
Martha felt the listening in the air as plainly as heat from a stove. "Then your cousin should mind her own porch," she said. She might have let it rest there if Mrs. Pike had not drawn breath through her teeth and said, "Well, men do fall into sin in those places." Something in Martha snapped, but not outwardly. Outwardly, she only turned her head and answered, "He did not fall into anything. He carried it with him." Mrs. Pike's eyes widened. The minister's wife flushed red enough to show through powder. Martha set down her untouched cup and walked out into the cold. The next day, 3 women called with excuses. One returned a dish, one brought turnips, one asked after Elsie's cough. By evening, the town knew more than Martha had ever said, and twice as much as was true. That winter came early and hard. Snow piled against the south wall, till Daniel had to shovel a path twice a day. The chimney smoked in certain winds. Elsie took a fever in January and lay for a week with hot cheeks and cracked lips, while Martha sat up nights changing cloths and counting breaths. Money went thin as thread. The second money order never came. Martha sold the silver-backed brush her mother had given her, and 2 lengths of good linen she had meant for Elsie's grown-up chest one day. She took in mending for the railroad men, and copied ledger figures in the evenings for Mr. Green, whose eyes were failing. At times she hated Thomas with such steadiness it felt almost like warmth. At times she imagined him returning to the gate, hat in hand, with some poor excuse worn smooth by rehearsal. In those moments she would see herself striking him with the flat of the shovel, or else simply stepping aside and letting him enter as though nothing had happened, and both visions shamed her. Near the end of February, another letter came, not from Thomas, not from Lydia, but from a lawyer in Albany, asking Martha to confirm whether she was still the legal wife of Thomas Bell. He regretted the indelicacy. It pertained to a matter of hospital records and guardianship involving a minor child. She sat with that letter in her lap while the stove ticked and settled. There it was, in the plain language of offices: legal wife, hospital, minor child, proof if proof had been needed. When Daniel came in from chopping kindling, he found her at the table with her face changed. He was old enough now to read weather in people. "What is it?" he said. She looked at him. Over the past year his boy's face had sharpened. There was Thomas in the brow and jaw, though Daniel was kinder in the eyes. She had been guarding him from the full truth out of habit, perhaps out of fear that knowing would harden him too soon. But hardship does not ask a mother's leave before entering a child. "Sit down," she said. He sat. "There is another child. Your father has another child in Albany with another woman." Daniel stared. For a moment she thought he had not understood. Then his face drained. "How long?" "I don't know exactly." "You knew?" "I learned in summer." "And you didn't tell us?" "Elsie was ill. We had winter to come. There was never the right hour for it." He stood up so suddenly the chair leg scraped. "He just left us for them?" "Yes," she said, "because there was no use dressing cruelty in better clothes."
It seems he did. Daniel turned away. He put both hands on the window-sill and stood looking out at the snowed yard where the woodpile leaned under white. After a while he said, in a voice she had never heard from him before, "Then he is dead to me." Martha wanted to say, "Do not say that. Do not make yourself into stone at 13." But she did not. She only said, You may feel that now." He gave a short, bitter laugh with no joy in it. "Feel? What else is there to feel?" She had no answer. In March, she traveled to Albany. It was the first time she had gone so far alone. Mrs. Holt agreed to keep Daniel and Elsie for 2 nights. Daniel objected, then swallowed it. Martha wore her plain black coat and carried a small carpet bag with 1 change of clothes, the lawyer's letter, and $12 sewn into the hem. On the train, she sat straight-backed among strangers who smelled of pomade, oranges, wet wool, and travel. Outside the window, the late winter fields gave way by degrees to denser towns, more smoke, more tracks crossing tracks, then mills, warehouses, rows of brick close as teeth. Albany unsettled her from the first step. The streets seemed always in motion. Men moved fast, women too, without nodding to one another. Carts rattled over cobbles, and every corner held some cry she could not sort from the next. Directions sent her 2 blocks wrong, then 3. By the time she found the address named in the lawyer's letter, her gloves were damp inside, and her head ached from noise. It was a narrow boarding house on a street that smelt faintly of coal and cabbage. The landlady, a broad woman in a striped apron, looked Martha over and asked, "Are you family?" Martha said, "Something like it." The room on the 3rd floor was small enough that one could stand by the bed and touch the washstand without reaching. A boy lay asleep under a quilt too thin for the weather. He was perhaps 4 years old, smaller than he should have been, with dark hair plastered damp to his forehead. In the chair by the window sat a woman sewing a cuff-back on a shirt. She looked up when Martha entered, and in that instant both knew. Lydia Gray was younger than Martha had imagined, though not truly young. There were half-moons of fatigue under her eyes, and a looseness about the mouth that comes from long disappointment. She was pretty still, but it was a worn prettiness, the sort that has had more crying than sleep. She set down the shirt. "You're his wife," she said. "Yes." Lydia nodded once, as if marking the end of an argument with herself. "I wondered whether you would come." "I did not until I had to." The woman's gaze flickered to the bed. "He took sick," she said quietly. "Tom, pneumonia, 3 weeks ago. He died at County." Martha stood perfectly still, not because she was stricken, not at first. The fact entered her almost without feeling, as though grief had taken all the room already, and death had to wait in the doorway. Thomas dead. Thomas who had walked out in the grey of morning. Thomas who had left 2 children and made a 3rd. Thomas whose return she had dreaded and rehearsed and resented in equal measure. Gone. Why the letter? She asked. He had no money by the end, no insurance worth naming. The hospital wanted kin, they wanted payment, they wanted signatures. Lydia gave a tired, almost embarrassed smile. Men can leave behind more trouble than possessions. Martha looked at the sleeping child. "Is he Thomas's?" "Yes." "And you thought I should help?" "I thought you should know," Lydia said. "As for help, I did not expect it. I barely expected you to come through the door." There was no insolence in the answer. That, more than anything, unsettled Martha. "What do you want from me?" she asked. Lydia let out a slow breath. "Nothing you owe. I have learned the difference.
I had been working at the laundry till the boy took bad. Tom said we'd marry as soon as he could make things straight. Then he coughed blood into a handkerchief and spent his last week begging pardon from God, with me standing there like a fool. Martha said before she could stop herself, "Did he beg pardon of me?" Lydia met her eyes. "He spoke your name once. He said you were stronger than he had deserved." The room held still. Outside, wheels rolled over the street below. Somewhere down the hall, a baby cried, was hushed, cried again. Martha moved closer to the bed. The boy's lashes were dark against his pale skin. He had Thomas's ears. She hated seeing that. She hated herself for noticing. "What is his name?" she asked.
James. The child stirred and coughed, a thin, tearing sound from deep in the chest. Martha's hands tightened on her bag. Lydia rose to pour water from the pitcher. "Doctor says he'll improve when the damp lets up." Doctors say such things because they have to say something. Martha did not know how long she stayed. An hour, perhaps, long enough to hear the whole shabby history. Lydia had met Thomas years earlier when he came to Albany on grain business for Pike and Son. He had said his marriage was finished in all but law. He had taken a room nearby, on and off, always promising the next arrangement would be honest. When she became pregnant, he spoke of a new start. Then work thinned, debts rose, and he delayed 1 month after another. In the end, he had not chosen one life over another with any courage. He had merely lied to both until sickness settled the matter. Martha listened without mercy, but also without interruption. There was almost relief in hearing meanness reduced to details, dates, rent, illnesses, excuses. Betrayal in the abstract can swell into monstrosity. Betrayal in facts is sordid, smaller, and somehow filthier. Before leaving, she took from her bag the $12 sewn into the hem and placed 10 on the washstand. Lydia's face changed. "No." "This is not for him," Martha said. "It is for the boy's medicine and coal. I cannot take your housekeeping money." "You can, or I can carry it downstairs and pay the landlady direct." The younger woman's eyes filled, though she fought it. "Why would you?" Martha looked at James, who had begun to wake and blink in the dim light with the confused solemnity of sick children. "Because none of this was his doing," she said. On the train home, she cried for the first time over Thomas's death. Not because love returned in purity, it did not. She cried because death had shut every door at once. There would be no reckoning now, no answer to the plain questions, no face made to hear what it had done. A live man may be accused, shamed, refused. A dead man leaves his women to divide the remains. Spring came late that year, but it came. Mud returned, then flies, then the smell of thawed grass. Martha told Daniel and Elsie that their father had died in Albany after an illness. She did not speak at once of the child. Daniel received the news with a hard stillness that frightened her more than tears would have. Elsie, only 8, cried because death was simpler to understand than betrayal. She made a little cross of sticks behind the barn and asked whether Papa would see it from heaven. Martha said she did not know, and that answer, which might have once sounded thin, now felt the only honest one. Through that summer, Martha worked harder than before. Widowhood brought its own peculiar mercy. The town preferred a widow to an abandoned wife.
Sympathy turned cleaner once there was a grave, even an unseen one. Men tipped hats. Women offered rides to market. The minister spoke of endurance and the mystery of God's will, which Martha endured for the sake of not making a scene in the pew. She began sewing in earnest for the dressmaker in town, not merely mending, but cutting and fitting. Her hands were good, and good hands make room for themselves. Every 6 weeks, without telling anyone, she sent a money order to Lydia Gray. At first, the sum was small enough to shame her, $3, $4, once only $2, yet she sent it. Lydia answered rarely, and when she did, her letters were spare and careful. James had put on weight. James had learned his letters. The laundry work was steadier. The landlady's niece had married and left a cot. Once Lydia enclosed a pressed violet and wrote, "He picked this because it was purple," and said, "Ladies like purple." Martha did not know what to do with such a thing, so she tucked it into the family Bible between Deuteronomy and Psalms and left it there. Years moved. That is how life truly does it, not by chapters one feels closing, but by small substitutions. Daniel's voice deepened, Elsie's ankles lengthened, and her pinafores grew short almost at once. The apple tree by the shed split in a storm and had to be cut back. Mrs. Pike died of a seizure in her pantry. Mr. Green's store got a new painted sign. The road out to the mill was graded. Men spoke first of new machines, then of trouble in Europe, then of things in newspapers that might as well have been on the moon until they were not. Martha's world widened a little and narrowed elsewhere. She became known as a woman who could be relied upon. That sounds like praise, and partly it is, but it is also the name communities give to those whose private softness has been used up in public usefulness. She sat with the dying, laid out infants, took casseroles to women after childbirth, hemmed wedding dresses for girls who were younger each year. She laughed sometimes, though not as carelessly before. Men approached her now and then in cautious ways, a widower after choir practice, a feed merchant with polished boots, once even Mr. Jameson, the clerk, who brought her peaches and spoke so awkwardly that she could only pretend not to notice. She did not encourage any of them. It was not only loyalty to Thomas that held her back, that would have been too noble. It was distrust. A life can become efficient around a wound, and she had built hers so. When Daniel was 17, he announced he meant to leave for Detroit to work in a motor plant. They were standing by the porch with a crate of jars between them. It was hot enough that the boards sweated pitch. "There's more money there," he said. "Mr. Holt's nephew wrote."
"You're not Mr. Holt's nephew." "No," he said. "I'm me." She looked at him. There it was again, the bell jaw sex stubborn under kinder eyes. "Your schooling has taken me far enough for the work I'll do, for the work you imagine you'll do." He gave her that look sons give mothers when love and impatience get tied in one knot. "I can't stay here forever." She nearly said, "Neither did your father." The bitterness rose with a speed that alarmed her. She swallowed it. "I know that," she said. "I only ask that you choose your leaving honestly." He frowned. "What does that mean?" "It means say where you're going, say why, right when you arrive. Do not vanish like a coward and call it necessity." His face changed. The sharpness went out of it. "I'm not him." "No," she said, quieter now. "You are not." He left in September. He did right, badly and with too much swagger at first. The factory was loud, the city huge, the boarding house poor, the pay fair, the men rough. Martha read every letter twice. She answered each one.
In winter, he sent $5 and a photograph of himself in a cap too stylish for her taste. On the back he had written, "For the mantle, so you remember I grew up." She laughed out loud at that, alone in the kitchen, and set the picture by the clock. Elsie stayed longer. She had Martha's patience and Thomas's gentler smile, a combination that made people trust her quickly. She trained as a schoolteacher in the county seat and came home on weekends smelling of ink and cold air, with books under her arm and ideas about education that sounded grander than the valley had space for. Martha listened, proud and worried. Pride and worry are sisters in mothers and seldom separate for long. It was in the autumn of 1918, with the leaves turning and the church bell ringing too often for funerals, that James Bell came to the house. The influenza had entered the valley as if carried on weather. One week there were rumors from town, the next there were curtains drawn at noon and black crape on doors. Martha had nursed Mrs. Holt through a fever and sat with old Jameson while he coughed himself empty, and she was coming back from the pump with a bucket in each hand when she saw a young man at the gate. He was perhaps 22, thin, dark-haired, wearing a coat that had been brushed more than once past decent life. For a moment in the slant of his shoulders she saw Thomas so sharply that the buckets nearly slipped from her hands. The young man stepped forward. "Mrs. Bell." "Yes, my name's James Gray." He hesitated, then corrected himself. "James Bell by blood, I suppose. My mother is Lydia." Martha set down the buckets very carefully. Water spilled over her shoes. He removed his cap. He looked as if he had come a long way under little certainty. "She's ill," he said, "and she asked me if things worsened to come to you. I know this is a great deal to bring to your door." Martha studied him. Thomas's ears as before, Thomas's brow, but the expression, the holding back of self in order not to presume, that was Lydia. She had received letters over the years, fewer as time passed, enough to know when James apprenticed at a printing shop, when Lydia took in piecework, when sickness came and went. Yet paper is mercifully flat. Flesh standing at one's door is another matter. "How bad is she?" He lowered his gaze. "Doctor says there is fluid in the lungs. She had this cough for months. She hid it while she could." Martha nodded once. The pump handle squealed in the breeze. Somewhere in the field a crow sounded. "Come in," she said. He crossed the threshold like a man unsure of his welcome and careful of every board. In the kitchen he stood with his cap crushed in both hands while Martha poured coffee. She noticed then how tired he was, how the collar frayed at the neck had been turned to seem whole, how hunger sat just beneath his politeness. "Eat," she said, cutting bread. "Thank you." When he had swallowed a first hurried piece and slowed enough to remember manners, he said, "She never wanted to trouble you. She said you had your own family and no reason to think of us kindly." Martha sat opposite him. That was sensible of her. He gave the smallest nod, not offended. She also said you were the truest person she had known.
That landed in a place Martha had not expected to feel. She had a poor sample then. He almost smiled. Maybe. By evening she had made up the spare room. She wrote a note to Elsie away at the county school and one to Daniel in Detroit, then sat with James as dusk thickened. He told her of Lydia's last years. Work at the laundry had worn her. A factory fire some streets over had blackened the air for weeks. She had never married. There were chances, he said, or so the neighbors said, but she didn't trust promises after my father. He looked up quickly, as if checking whether the word itself was an insult in this house. Martha said nothing. She kept every money order you sent stubbed in an envelope. Said one day I ought to know who helped keep coal in the stove. I suppose I owe you thanks, though thanks seems small. It was not for thanks. I know. 3 days later, Lydia died in Albany before Martha could reach her. James, who had meant to leave after one night, stayed for the funeral arrangements there and returned a week later with a small trunk, a bundle of books, and nowhere else he wished to be. That was when the old life cracked open a second time. Daniel came home at Christmas and found James at the table mending a harness strap. The resemblance struck him like an insult. He set down his bag so hard the floor shook. "Who's this?" he asked, though he knew. Martha said, "This is James. He'll be with us a while." Daniel's eyes moved from her to James and back. "A while." James stood. "I can step out." "No," Martha said. Daniel laughed once under his breath. "Why not? Seems stepping out runs in the family." Elsie, just through the door with Holly in her arms, stopped dead. "Daniel." But Daniel had months and years in him. He gets a place at the table now, after all of it? James went pale but held his ground. "I didn't ask to be born into your grievance." Daniel took a step forward. Martha rose at once. "That is enough," she said. He looked at her as if she had struck him. "Enough? For who? For all of you. I will not have your father's sins turned into inheritance. He was his father too." "Yes," Martha said. "And did that help him any?" Silence held. Daniel's chest heaved once. Elsie set down the holly very gently. James did not move. At last Daniel turned away and walked out into the yard without his coat. Elsie went after him. That night the house felt divided into provinces. James remained in the spare room with a lamp low. Daniel sat on the porch steps till cold drove him in, then took the settle by the stove and pretended sleep. Martha, who had carried harder burdens than this and yet felt suddenly ancient, washed dishes that did not need washing. Later, when the kitchen was dim and Daniel still lay with his forearm across his eyes, she said, "You may hate the situation, you may hate what it reminds you of, but you will not punish him for your father." Daniel's voice came muffled. "So he just becomes family because you say so?" He becomes a young man whose mother is dead and whose life was bent before he could stand. That is enough. He lowered his arm. "And what about me? You think this doesn't bend mine all over again?" Martha leaned one hand on the table. "I know it does, but pain is not rank. Yours is not nobler because it came first." He stared at her. Then, because he was still her son beneath the hurt, his face broke a little. "I wanted him to have done it to us only," he said in a raw, ashamed voice. "Isn't that ugly?" "Yes," she answered, "and human." After that, the work of becoming something like a family began, and it was work. Not miracle, not sentiment, work. James found employment at the local paper in the county seat, setting type and sweeping floors at first, then correcting proofs because his eye was good. He gave Martha a portion for board, though she protested. He repaired the gate without being asked, read aloud neatly on Sundays when the minister's throat gave out, and listened more than he spoke. Elsie, who saw loneliness in others as some people see weather coming, took to him first. Daniel resisted longest, then one afternoon found James in the shed trying and failing to fix the cracked brace on a plough yoke. "You're doing that wrong," Daniel muttered. "Very likely." Daniel stood a moment longer, then said, move. They spent an hour over the yoke. By supper they were speaking of hinges and wood grain instead of fathers. In some houses, reconciliation arrives with tears and embraces. In this one, it came through tools, shared labor, and the practical language of men not ready for more. The years after the Great War were not easy, but they were full. Elsie married a quiet pharmacist named Owen Marks and moved 2 streets over, close enough that her children trailed in and out of Martha's kitchen like visiting birds. Daniel married later, not because he lacked chances, but because trust ripens slowly in those who have watched promises rot. His wife, Clara, was plain, sharp-minded, and unimpressed by male moods, which suited him better than prettiness would have. James never married at all, though once Martha suspected there was a girl at the newspaper. If there was, it came to nothing. He said little. He was the sort of man who seemed always to stand half a step aside from his own hopes, as though careful not to crowd them. Martha grew older without ceremony. Her hair silvered at the temples, then all over. Her hands knotted at the knuckles. She no longer rose before everyone else because the grandchildren beat her to the kitchen on Sundays. Yet inside she remained divided in places only she knew. Some evenings, shelling peas or darning socks, she would think of Thomas not as a villain carved in black, but as a man in a brown coat, coughing in a narrow hospital bed, asking pardon too late. Other evenings she thought of the ring on the washstand and felt again the old cold humiliation as if no year had passed. Time did not erase, it layered, that was all. One rainy afternoon in 1932, when the Depression had thinned pockets and thickened tempers all over town, Martha climbed the attic stairs looking for quilt batting and came upon the old carpet bag from Albany. It had been pushed behind a trunk for years. Inside lay the lawyer's letter, Lydia's first note, a faded photograph of Thomas holding Daniel as a baby, and an envelope of money order stubs Lydia had once returned after James came to stay. Martha sat on the attic floorboards among dust and old smells and spread the papers in her lap. Through the rain on the roof she could hear life below. Clara speaking to one child, another banging a spoon, James at the table reading the paper aloud to Owen, who always missed the small print without admitting it. The house no longer held only the first family, or the second. It held what had survived both. She picked up Lydia's earliest letter and read the line again. A child should not have to ask. No, Martha said aloud to the empty attic. He should not. She had not spoken to Lydia in years, not really, yet there in the dimness she felt something close to companionship with that dead woman. Not friendship exactly, their history would not soften so cleanly, but recognition. They had each built a life around the damage done by the same man. They had each spent years turning bitterness into bread, coal, medicine, ordinary days. Men receive the larger names in family stories. It is the women who do the longer work. When Martha came down, James looked up from the newspaper. You've been gone a while. Attics keep their own time, she said. He smiled. Did you find what you needed? Yes, she answered, and meant more than batting. The final turning came not with scandal, but with illness, as so many final turnings do. Martha was 68 when she took to bed with a weakness that did not pass. At first she called it fatigue, then the stairs became too much, then the thought of soup wearied her. Dr. Avery, older himself now and smelling of peppermint, pressed his fingers under her jaw and spoke in the measured way doctors use when they know plainness will hurt but vagueness will insult. You must conserve your strength. For what? She asked. He did not answer quickly enough. So the bed came into the front room where the winter light was best. Elsie changed sheets and made broth. Clara brought stewed apples. Daniel chopped extra wood, though there was already enough.
James read to her in the evenings when her eyes tired, newspaper columns, scripture, once even a chapter from a Dickens novel, because he claimed everybody deserved at least one dramatic deathbed scene with English weather in it. She laughed at that until it turned to coughing. One night, when the lamp was low and the others had gone home because snow was starting and she had insisted they not fuss like mourners before there was cause, she asked James to sit closer. He moved his chair near the bed. The room held that hushed quality winter nights can have, as if the dark itself were padded. In the drawer of the secretary there's an envelope with Lydia's letters. I know. You know? He nodded. I saw the name years ago and guessed the rest. I did not read them. She looked at him, this man who once stood thin and uncertain at her gate. You grew into a better man than your father.
He was silent for a moment. That owes more to the women he wronged than to me. Yes, she said. Maybe. Snow tapped lightly at the window. The lamp hissed once. Did you ever forgive him? James asked. It was not an easy question, nor was it pious. He asked as a man who had the right to know what shape such wounds may take if one lives long enough with them. Martha lay looking at the ceiling where lamplight trembled. Not once, she said at last. Not in a single noble moment the way ministers describe. What happened was smaller. Some days I hated him less because there were beans to shell and children to feed. Some years I thought of him rarely. Some nights I pitied him. Then something would return, the ring, the lie, the look on Daniel's face, and I would be angry again. Perhaps forgiveness, if I had it, came in fragments so tiny I never saw the whole. James folded his hands. That sounds honest. It is all I have left to give. After a while, she said, "Bring me the box from the mantel." He did. From it, she took Thomas's wedding ring, which she had kept all those years without quite knowing why. The gold looked smaller than memory. I used to think I held on to this to remember. Then I thought I held on to it so I would never soften falsely. Now I think perhaps I was waiting to know where it belonged. She placed it in his palm. He looked startled. No. Yes. It was yours. It was his, Martha said, and he was yours too, whether for pride or shame or neither. Keep it or throw it in the river. I am finished deciding what ought to be done with him. His fingers closed slowly around the ring. For the first time since she had known him, his composure failed completely. He bent his head. When he spoke, his voice was rough. "You have given me more than I can deserve." That, she said, with the old edge still alive in her, is Bell family tradition. Best improve on it. He laughed through tears, and because she loved him then as plainly as if she had borne him, she reached out and laid her hand over his. Martha lived through that winter and into spring, which surprised everyone, except perhaps Martha herself. Dying, like forgiveness, is often less tidy than expected. She weakened, rallied a little, weakened again. There were daffodils by the fence before the last day came. It was morning. The window was open just enough to let in the smell of damp soil and the sound of hens fussing. Elsie sat on one side of the bed, sewing at something she did not need to sew. Daniel stood by the mantel, pretending interest in the clock. Clara moved quietly in the kitchen. James had gone to fetch Dr. Avery, though all of them knew that doctors are mostly summoned at the end, so no one must feel they did nothing. Martha woke from a doze and looked from one beloved face to the next. Not all born of her body, but all hers in the labor that matters most. "Don't make those funeral expressions yet," she murmured. Elsie smiled and cried at the same time. "You always did dislike fuss. Fuss wastes daylight." Daniel came closer. The boy he had been was still there, somewhere under grey at the temples and work in the hands.
Is there anything you need?" Martha thought of bread dough under Dawn hands, of a ring on a washstand, of a sick child in Albany, of money sewn in a hem, of winters, letters, births, deaths, small economies, grudges endured long enough to change shape. She thought of how little in life had arrived pure and how much had yet become dear. "No," she said, "only this. Do not let one person's cowardice become the law of your whole lives." Daniel bowed his head. Elsie pressed the sewing into her lap to stop her hands shaking. When James returned with the doctor, Martha was already slipping from speech, yet she opened her eyes once more and found him. He came to the bedside and bent low. "There you are," she whispered. "I'm here." She looked at him, then at Daniel and Elsie beyond, and a faint peace, almost amusement, touched her mouth. "Strange family. The best kind," he said. She gave the smallest nod, as if conceding a point after long thought. Her hand moved once over the blanket, then stilled. Afterwards there was the usual work. There is always work after death, which is one reason the living bear it. Water to heat, candles to set, a black dress to brush, calls to make, plates arriving under cloths, voices lowered in doorways.
The town spoke of Martha Bell as steady, capable, long-suffering, generous. Such words were not wrong, they were only incomplete, as words for the dead often are. They buried her on a clear day, under a pale spring sky. Daniel stood straight but red-eyed. Elsie leaned into Owen. Clara held the children back from the fresh earth. James stood a little apart until Daniel, without looking at him, shifted one step to make room. James took it. Years later, people still spoke of Martha when some younger woman found herself left or lied to or simply worn down by the long unevenness of life. "Do as Martha Bell did," they would say, though none of them knew exactly what that meant. Some meant endure, some meant work, some meant keep your dignity, some meant open the door where no door should be open. The truth was harder and less suitable for sayings. Martha had not behaved according to one principle. She had stumbled, judged, withheld, given, hardened, softened, and gone on. She had failed at holiness and succeeded at humanity, which in the end may be the rarer achievement. James kept the ring in a drawer for years, then one summer walked to the river at dusk and cast it into the current. He watched the small circle break the surface and vanish. He felt no thunder, no revelation, only a quietness that seemed earned. Daniel saw him return and asked no question. Elsie, hearing of it later, nodded as if some account long open had finally been settled. The children grew, and then their children. The house changed hands but kept the same creak in the hall and the same plum trees in back, though one had to be cut down after lightning struck it clean through. At family tables, the story of Thomas Bell was told less often than the story of Martha, Lydia, Daniel, Elsie, and James. Not because men do not wound history, but because wounds alone do not make a lineage. What survives us is also the repair. And so, if you imagine that little kitchen at dawn, the flour on the apron, the child asleep by the stove, the sound of a hired cart at the gate, you might think the story began with abandonment, but perhaps it began elsewhere. Perhaps it began in the choice not to let betrayal decide the size of a heart.
Perhaps it began when one woman put $10 on a washstand in a room that should never have existed in her life. Or perhaps it began every single time she rose in the morning and made bread anyway. Tell me, if life had wronged you in that slow and ordinary way it wronged her, would you have closed the door forever? Or would you have found room somehow for the broken things that were never your fault to begin with?